We wear it, our spirits lift. It helps us grow strong in body and in mind. As we wear it, we learn patience and respect. The belt system motivates students to strive harder and continue growing. This uniform shapes movement into grace and turns performance into something thrilling. Now, embraced around the world, Taekwondo shares our culture, philosophy, and values with pride and spirit. Though it may seem simple, this uniform holds your passion and your journey. It belongs to Taekwondo. Wear the extraordinary. Be with Taekwondo.
President Lee Jae-myung on Tuesday addressed the National Assembly so that his record of $508 billion budget for 2026 can be poured into new growth engines, such as artificial intelligence. Defense chiefs of Seoul and Washington held their annual security talks here in Seoul, where the American Defense Secretary promised interagency effort to help South Korea construct nuclear-powered submarines. And China has extended its visa-free entry policy for South Korean nationals for another year, which is seen as a follow-up to the success of the summit between the two countries' leaders in Gyeongju last week. President Lee Jae-myung addressed the National Assembly this morning for his government's budget proposal for next year. He called for bipartisan support to open up the era of artificial intelligence. Our Yoon Jung-min leads us tonight.
The focus of the 2026 budget proposal was on seeking new growth engines, with President Lee Jae-myung calling it the very first budget to open up the era of AI.
국제 무역 통상 질서의 재편과 인공지능 대전환의 파도 앞에서 국가 생존을 모색해야 할 절체절명의 위기에 처해 있습니다. 이제는 인공지능 시대의 고속도로를 구축해서 도약과 성장의 새로운 미래를 열어야 합니다.
The government has projected a record high of 728 trillion won, or over $508 billion for next year's budget, up 8% from this year. Nearly $7 billion has been earmarked for AI-related projects, 3 times higher than this year's spending, with a focus on physical AI and use of the technology in robots and automobiles. Next year's defense spending will be expanded by more than 8%, worth over $46 billion, with more use of AI by the defense forces, as the commander-in-chief called for self-reliant defense.
전 세계 5위의 군사력으로 평가받는 우리 대한민국이 국방을 외부에 의존한다는 것은 우리 국민의 자존심 문제 아니겠습니까?
Other areas of focus were on the R&D budget, which will be a record high, as well as the so-called National Growth Fund, NK Culture. He also vowed to secure a social safety net and help small business owners through local consumption coupons. And looking back on last week's diplomatic super week, the president said uncertainties over the economy have been eased by reaching a trade deal with the U.S. As the president called for across-the-aisle collaboration, speaking before a two-thirds full Congress, following a boycott by the main opposition People Power Party over an arrest warrant against its party member.
좀 허전하군요.
The mood was starkly contrasting as the ruling Democratic Party lawmakers responded to the president with rounds of applause. The legal deadline for the parliamentary budget review is set for December 2nd. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
So the government has submitted next year's budget proposal, and with the National Assembly beginning its deliberations this week, a fierce debate is expected over the expansionary fiscal stance and the president's key policy programs. For more, we turn to our political correspondent, Moon Hae-ryun. Welcome back, Hae-ryun.
Good evening, Tammy.
So Hae-ryun, we just heard President Lee Jae-myung deliver his speech on the budget proposal. Walk us through the key agenda and the review schedule for now.
That's right. So as you've said, the president revealed the outline of the government's first full-year budget in his policy speech this morning. And with this, Parliament will kick off its budget review. On Wednesday, so tomorrow, the National Assembly's Special Committee on Budget and Accounts will hold a public hearing on the proposal, where experts and committee members debate on the core contents of the budget bill. This will then be followed up by general policy inquiries on Thursday and Friday this week. The committee will then summon officials from various ministries to thoroughly examine the budget bill, and it does this by dividing the ministries into economic and non-economic ministries. So the likes of the Ministry of Economy and Finance would be categorized into the former, while those such as the Ministry of Education will be sorted into the latter. Economic ministries will be reviewed on the 10th and the 11th, and non-economic ministries on the 12th and the 13th. And during this process, the members of the National Assembly will ask questions about major items for increase or reduction, policy priorities, and the feasibility of budget execution. Then, from November 17th, a budget adjustment subcommittee begins the detailed review process, adjusting spending before the deadline of December 2nd.
Right, so Hae-ryun, this is the first budget proposal under the Lee Jae-myung administration. Now, what are the highlights of the proposal? Walk us through them.
Right, so the 728 trillion won budget for 2026, it's aimed at both recovery and growth through bold fiscal spending. It's the largest budget in South Korea's history, and the government says it's focusing on performance-based fiscal management, so cutting inefficient projects while investing heavily in key growth engines. 27 trillion won, just under $19 billion was cut to restructure inefficient projects and administrative costs. And aside from the focus on AI and research and development, as outlined by President Lee in his policy speech, other notable allocations include support for industries affected by U.S. tariffs and direct cash payments for rural residents as part of new pilot programs. With the South Korea-U.S. summit during the APEC leaders meeting in Gyeongju still fresh in people's minds and the local elections coming up next year, it's no surprise that the budget reflects these priorities. And another big aspect of government spending plans for next year includes social safety nets and housing, which reflect ongoing efforts to address Korea's demographic shifts.
So the budget proposals sound promising as they are planned to go into new growth engines like AI, but the record budget also comes with a great controversy. How are the main opposition and the ruling parties reacting to this?
That's right. So today, the main opposition, People Power Party, actually boycotted President Lee's policy speech this morning at the National Assembly, protesting what it calls political oppression by the government. Wearing black masks and ribbons, reading Mourning for Liberal Democracy, opposition lawmakers staged a silent protest on the steps of the main hall, condemning the recent arrest warrant request for former floor leader Chu Kyung-ho in relation to the failed martial law order last December. The Speaker of the National Assembly, Woo Won-sik, opened the session by welcoming the president's visit, noting that while political discord remains, cooperation is vital.
Since this is a very crucial time, I believe it's especially important for the National Assembly and the government to work closely together and take a step forward in cooperation.
He praised the administration's diplomatic gains at the recent APEC leaders meeting, saying they restored market confidence and national pride. Democratic Party lawmakers applauded repeatedly throughout the president's 22-minute speech, particularly as he highlighted the government's efforts to stabilize the economy and improve citizens' livelihoods.
Well, do keep us posted on this political clash between the ruling and main opposition parties over the next year's budget. Hae-ryun, thank you so much for coming in tonight.
Thank you for having me, Tammy.
South Korea should be able to launch its first nuclear-powered submarine using its own technology in the mid to late 2030s, following the recent agreement with the U.S. on nuclear fuel supplies. That's according to a Defense Ministry official, Won Jong-dae, during Tuesday's cabinet meeting, where he added that Korea may begin construction in the late 2020s if it secures fuel from the U.S. through consultation. For that, a pan-governmental task force will be set up. And during the Korea-U.S. summit last week, President Lee Jae-myung asked his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump to allow Korea to secure nuclear fuel supplies for submarines. Trump later approved that such submarines could be built at a Philadelphia shipyard owned by South Korea's Hanwha Ocean. And President Lee Jae-myung told the U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth that South Korea's plans to regain wartime operational control from Washington within its 5-year term will further strengthen Seoul and Washington's alliance. According to presidential spokesperson Kang Yoo-jung, during their meeting at the Yongsan presidential office today on Tuesday, the president said the move would help ease America's defense burden in the Indo-Pacific region. He also expressed appreciation to U.S. President Donald Trump for supporting South Korea's shipbuilding of nuclear-powered submarines. Secretary Hegseth responded that Washington will actively support Seoul's efforts to bolster its self-defense capabilities, citing increased defense spending and developing such subs. And Defense Minister An Gyu-baek and his U.S. counterpart Pete Hegseth held their annual security talks on Tuesday. A joint communique was not released, but they did tap into ways to boost defense ties. Our defense correspondent Kim Bo-kyung has the details.
The South Korean and U.S. defense chiefs reaffirmed the steadfastness of the ROK-U.S. alliance during their annual security talks, the 57th Security Consultative meeting on Tuesday. A joint communique was not released, waiting for a joint fact sheet for the two countries to come out first. Still, Defense Minister An Gyu-baek and U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth did share some parts of the discussion they had during the meeting. Regarding the nuclear-powered submarines, which Trump recently gave approval to, the Pentagon vowed support across its departments.
We're going to work closely with the Department of State and the Department of Energy to fulfill President Trump's commitment in a deliberate manner. And I think it's a reflection of something I said, that the president wants allies to be strong.
Noting that South Korea is a model ally, Hegseth said he was encouraged by South Korea's commitment to increase defense spending and make greater investments in ROK military capabilities. To modernize the alliance and boost ties, the two allies agreed on some practical steps, including having U.S. warships be repaired in South Korea to ensure their most lethal capability remains ready to respond to any crisis. As to whether the U.S. forces Korea could be used against China in the Taiwan Strait, U.S. Defense Chief underlined the importance of flexibility, but said the USFK is oriented to protect South Korea from the north.
There's no doubt, flexibility for regional contingencies is something we would take a look at, but we are focused on standing by our allies here and ensuring the threat of the DPRK is not a threat to the Republic of Korea, and certainly continue to extend nuclear deterrence as we have before.
The comment resonates with the two defense chiefs' earlier visit to the joint security area within the demilitarized zone on Monday for the first time in 8 years. Meanwhile, when asked about whether South Korea hopes to pursue nuclear weapons development, Minister An clearly said this was not possible.
South Korea is part of the NPT, so it's not allowed to have nuclear weapons. Therefore, developing nuclear weapons in South Korea would not be possible.
He further added that because South Korea cannot possess nuclear weapons, the Combined Nuclear and Conventional Integration System, integrating U.S. nuclear capabilities with South Korea's conventional weapons, has been established. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Though the much-anticipated meeting between the leaders of Pyongyang and Washington did not take place on the sidelines of the APEC leaders meeting last week, signs do indicate that North Korea have been preparing for the possibility. And that is according to South Korea's National Intelligence Service on Monday. On Tuesday, during a National Assembly inspection of the agency, the NIS reportedly stated that there have been indications that Pyongyang has been getting ready for possible talks with the U.S., such as analyzing policy tendencies of working-level officials within the U.S. administration. It also added that if the right conditions are met, the North is likely to seek contact with Washington. In the meantime, the U.S. is pushing to impose new sanctions on ships suspected of violating the UN Security Council resolutions for illegally exporting North Korean coal and iron ore to China. Lee Seung-jae explains more.
The United States has moved to impose new sanctions on 7 ships accused of violating United Nations Security Council resolutions by smuggling North Korean coal and iron ore. According to Reuters, Washington will soon ask the UN North Korea Sanctions Committee to blacklist the vessels, which allegedly transported the banned minerals to China and other destinations. A senior U.S. official said North Korea earns between $200 and $400 million annually through such illegal exports, which are used to fund its nuclear and missile programs. The official also revealed that in May and June, a North Korean vessel named Shinpyeong-6 transferred coal to a Sierra Leone-flagged ship called Fly Free on the high seas, later offloading at China's Weifang port. However, to enact the sanctions, all UN Security Council members must agree unanimously. But with China and Russia both having close diplomatic ties to Pyongyang and holding veto powers, the proposal faces steep obstacles. If adopted, the 7 ships could be barred from entering ports worldwide, and related shipping firms or individuals could face asset freezes and travel bans. Analysts say the move underscores Washington's effort to tighten financial pressure on the Kim Jong-un regime amid renewed concerns over North Korea's weapons development and deepening ties with Moscow and Beijing. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
In the meantime, China has announced that it will extend its visa-free policy for 45 countries, including South Korea. So people who are visiting tourism for business or tourism can stay up to 30 days until the end of next year. Our An Sung-jin has more.
China has extended its visa-free entry policy for South Korean nationals for another year. This allows a short-term stay of up to 30 days for tourism, business, or family visits until December 31st, 2026. The announcement was made on Monday by China's foreign ministry as part of a plan to make travel more convenient and strengthen international exchanges.
To facilitate cross-border travel between Chinese and foreign nationals, China has decided to extend the visa-free policy for France and several other countries until December 31st, 2026.
The extension applies to 45 countries that were already covered by the temporary visa-free policy, including South Korea, Japan, France, and others. Adding to the list, China will expand the policy to include Sweden starting from November 10th. Analysts say this decision reflects positive momentum in bilateral relations between South Korea and China following the recent summit talks between the country's leaders on the sidelines of the APEC economic leaders meeting in Gyeongju. South Korea has also been implementing its own temporary visa-free policy for Chinese group tourists since last September to encourage reciprocal tourism and improve people-to-people exchanges. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
And now here on the local front, while the Bank of Korea held interest rates steady for a third straight month in October, consumer price increases surged to 2.4%. That's the largest rise since July of last year. Ian-jin reports.
South Korea's consumer prices grew at the fastest pace in 15 months in October. According to data released by the Ministry of Data and Statistics on Tuesday, South Korea's consumer prices last month increased 2.4% from a year earlier. This marks the largest on-year increase since July 2024, when they increased by 2.6%. Looking at 2025, on-year consumer price increases have been higher than the Bank of Korea's target of 2% from January to April, then slowed slightly in May to 1.9%, before going back above the 2% mark for June and July. On-year consumer price increases briefly slowed to 1.7% in August, but then climbed over 2% again in September before hitting a new high for the year in October. The ministry said that October's figures were primarily due to a sharp increase in prices for agricultural and fishery products, which jumped 3.1%, adding 0.25 percentage points to the overall figure. Pork in particular rose 6.1%, and mackerel rose 11%. Processed food and petroleum products also added upward pressure on prices, rising 3.5% and 4.8% respectively. Core inflation, which excludes energy prices and foods that often see short-term price fluctuations, rose 2.2% in October, which is higher than September's 2% increase. 이은진, Arirang News.
And now over in the U.S., as the government shutdown there nears its second month, flight delays are piling up due to staffing shortages. The country's transportation secretary says airspace will be closed if it becomes too risky to travel. Cha Young-kyung reports.
Millions of air passengers in the U.S. have been hit by delays or canceled flights due to a spike in staffing shortages amid a lack of pay as the government shutdown enters its second month.
Last night was really bad. It was thousands of people around here all over, all the way outside for really long lines.
We're going to be here probably for about 5 hours now because we thought we had to check in early because of what's going on. So slightly disappointing, but yeah.
Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy says the Trump administration would close all U.S. airspace if it thought an ongoing government shutdown made it too risky to travel. During an interview with CNBC on Monday local time, he said it is not currently at that point. Rather, there are just significant delays. Duffy also added that any absent air traffic controllers are not going to be fired, but issued a plea for them to go to work. As the shutdown has forced 13,000 air traffic controllers and 50,000 Transportation Security Administration officers to work without pay, airlines such as Delta, United, Southwest, and American Airlines all called on Congress to quickly pass a stopgap funding bill, citing aviation safety risks. Scott Kirby, CEO of United Airlines, told Reuters that he's seriously concerned about disruptions to flight bookings and operations with the Thanksgiving holiday at the end of November when travel demand peaks. Cha Young-kyung, Arirang News.
Typical autumn temperatures returned in the afternoon. It was fine to take off your warm coat and change into something thinner thanks to milder weather. In the middle of the day, Seoul rose to 16 degrees Celsius, which is very similar to the average temperature at this time of year. However, since there are huge temperature gaps between the morning and daytime, please take good care of your health. As we go into the second half of the week, the daytime temperatures will rise further tomorrow. There will be warm autumn weather in the Seoul at around 19 degrees both tomorrow and Thursday. Seoul and Gyeongju will start at 6 degrees tomorrow morning with Chuncheon at 3 degrees. Daily highs will rise to 18 to 22 degrees all over the country. On Friday, rain is forecast in the eastern parts of Gangwon-do province and in the south and on Jeju Island over the weekend. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is all we have for tonight. I'm Kim Dami. From all of us here at Arirang, thanks for watching and good night.
Korea, a globally recognized sports powerhouse. Behind the dazzling achievements, there's always an invisible force at work. With sophisticated materials, cutting-edge equipment, and innovative technological solutions, SMEs in the K-sports industry play a vital role in bolstering Korea's status as a sports powerhouse. By integrating AI technology, they unlock athletes' potential and enhance performance, elevating the sports environment to the next level and opening new markets in the sports industry. Their innovative technology and bold challenges drive the growth of Korea's sports industry, creating a better world through sports. The innovation of these SMEs never stops. A systematic partnership support program is implemented to discover promising sports SMEs, provide technical validation and R&D support to enhance competitiveness, and strengthen the foundation for overseas expansion. At Tokyo Sportech 2025, the technological prowess of Korean companies was recognized. The Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism, and the Korea Sports Promotion Foundation supported K-sports companies with product promotion and business consultations with global buyers, demonstrating product quality and market potential, and confirming the possibility of expanding into the global market.
저희는 ICT 강국으로서 그 바이어나 사용자들한테 신기술을 접목한 생활 스포츠 기회를 실질적으로 확대할 수 있는 그 기회를 제공하는 데 많은 도움이 될 수 있으리라고 확신을 합니다.
이제 스포츠도 K죠. K 스포츠는 이겁니다.
The joy for all, created by the power of K-sports. Experience the future of the new sports industry through the innovation and technology of the Korean sports industry.
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gan. South Korea wrapped up a packed week of diplomacy, hosting APEC in Gyeongju and holding consecutive summits with the U.S., China, and Japan. From resolving the tariff dispute with Washington to opening dialogue with Beijing and restarting shuttle diplomacy with Tokyo, President Lee Jae-myung focused on practical, interest-driven engagement. With both U.S. President Trump and Chinese President Xi visiting Korea, the country drew attention as a possible diplomatic bridge. And with COP30 and the G20 coming up, the question now is how this momentum might shape Seoul's next move on the global stage. For a deeper discussion on this, we connect to Im Eun-jung, Professor of International Studies at Korea National University. A big welcome.
Hello, good evening.
And also joining us from Busan is Robert Kelly, Professor of International Relations at Busan National University. Good to see you, Professor.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, Professor Kelly, let's start off right away. So I wonder about your personal assessment of South Korea's overall diplomacy during the APEC leaders meeting in Gyeongju. Were there particular moments or outcomes that stood out for you?
Yeah, I think the big one was Trump and Xi meeting, right? I think there was a lot of global focus on this. It provided South Korea provided kind of like a middle space or sort of bridge, as you mentioned, sort of to use your term, a sort of bridge space for the two sides to meet. It's pretty clear that U.S.-China relations have been on a downward spiral this year, particularly since Trump declared Liberation Day, the tariff wars, what was that, I think back in March. And things have only gotten worse, right? And it was a good opportunity for Donald Trump and Xi to actually meet and start to work on some of the details. And there was some progress, right? At the very least, it seems like the tariff war is going to be somewhat better, right? It looks like, for example, the U.S. sort of soybean export to China is going to come back at least somewhat. There's been some movement on chips and rare earths and stuff like that. I think it was a shame you didn't get too much movement on the strategic issues like Taiwan or the South China Sea or something like that. But maybe that was a bridge too far to expect that something like this. But I think the fact that South Korea was able to provide something along the lines of a neutral territory, a neutral space for this to occur was pretty good. On the other hand, I think the Gyeongju Declaration was kind of like all the other previous APEC declarations, didn't really say a great deal, in part because you got 21 different countries with 21 different interests. It's hard to get them to agree on anything, right? So I'm not sure that APEC itself, I'm not convinced that APEC itself is a particularly useful organization beyond just being a platform. But the fact that you did have this big China-U.S. Meeting, and then of course all the other bilaterals, right, particularly with the U.S. and South Korea, I think that was all pretty valuable.
Wow, Professor, thank you for that great overview. It really helps set the stage for the next things that followed. Let's bring in Professor Lim to the conversation as well. So from the APEC meetings to back-to-back bilaterals with Washington, Beijing, and Tokyo, what kind of diplomatic direction or signaling do you think has emerged from this super week of diplomacy?
Well, before again the APEC, I think of many countries in the world and many people in this country also. I think we have been worried about the success of the APEC at Gyeongju, not only just because of international circumstances. Now we all know, Mr. Trump, President Trump's that so-called again the tariff policy that can, of course, in some senses, we try to, of course, understand U.S.'s strategy with the new situations across the border. But at the same time, this is a huge challenge, especially to the country like Korea, because South Korea has been prosperous through the free trade. With many different countries. Including, of course, the United States. So all this kind of, bilateral approaches has been regarded as a big challenge. And as the other panelists, again, the Professor Kelly pointed out, U.S.-China strategic rivalry was another external factor that was, again, the undermining kind of, the ground of the multilateral mechanism, such as, again, the APEC. And internally, too, domestically as well. Our politics has been in a trouble for months, and the new government did have very limited time to be really prepared for such a big meeting. Big multilateral meeting in this country. So from the many different angles, I think many people have been worried. However, still the outcome I think was pretty much satisfactory. Most important thing is I think everybody who came to the Gyeongju, I think they have been reconfirmed with the fact that still APEC-like a platform is useful because many important countries can gather together, and not only just through the more open multilateral talk, through a series of bilateral talks, again, that they can have a very natural dialogue. So this kind of, again, the opportunity. I think this opportunity gave us, again, provided us, again, another good moment to think about the importance of multilateral mechanism.
Right, definitely. So there had been a lot of accomplishments over the week, but let's first drill into the U.S. summit with South Korea. The long debated tariff issue, of course, it was nearly settled just ahead of the APEC week. What do you think are the most tangible gains for South Korea from that deal, Professor Lim?
Well, all this tariff-related negotiation is painful. Of course, South Korea is not the only case, but especially for a country like South Korea, because again, as I mentioned earlier, South Korea is a trading country, one of the biggest trading country in the world. And in addition to that, we have KORUS FTA, free trade agreement with the United States. The process for that was painful too, but thanks to the FTA with the United States, we both, I think, mutually have been beneficial. However, now again, we live in a very different world, and now we need to adjust everything. So that's the reality we face. So I don't want to really go back to all this, new reality. But tariff is, of course, as a pain and burden our economy needs to digest. But at the same time, probably bigger, heavier burden was, again, the huge astronomical number of investment. Again, 350 billion US dollar should be invested in the United States. And if you think about the foreign reserve of South Korea as of June 2024, 25, this year, June, as of June this year, our whole foreign reserve is about like 410 billion. So, 350 billion is almost like 70-80% of our whole foreign reserve. So definitely, it is such a big money. So our government was trying to negotiate with the Washington's counterparts, how to deliver this money to the United States. And the biggest, I think, achievement is, again, we agreed on the cap, annual cap. So per year, we have a certain amount of money, which is again the cap to limit the whole amount of money that can be invested from South Korea to the United States, which is crucial because it can be directly influential over foreign exchange rate, again, between the Korean won and US dollar.
Right, so it definitely seemed to reduce the risks from South Korea's hand. Now, moving on, another noteworthy issue was President Trump's approval of nuclear-powered submarines and the discussion around revising the nuclear cooperation agreement. I believe it came just shortly after President Lee's proposal. So from a diplomatic standpoint, Professor Kelly, what does this breakthrough actually represent for South Korea's strategic posture?
Yeah, I have to say that I'm actually rather surprised this is even an issue at all, right? I mean, the idea that South Korea, which is a pretty wealthy country and a long-established U.S. ally and sort of loyal, and the U.S. military is deeply integrated into South Korea's military posture. I mean, the idea that South Korea would have limits on sort of like the missiles it can build and the ships and what kind of engines, all that strikes me as sort of throwbacks, really, to sort of decades past, when Park Chung-hee or some colonel might pop out of nowhere and try to overthrow the government, and therefore we shouldn't let South Korea have these certain kinds of weapons. That's all over. And I think that's really sort of a recognition of this. I would actually argue that this is pretty low-hanging fruit, that I mean, it's good that South Korea got it, but this doesn't strike me actually as kind of the big breakthrough it's been marketed in the South Korean media, because quite honestly, I don't think it really makes any sense that the United States puts these kind of strategic restrictions on South Korea. If anything, I'd like to see them even looser, right? Donald Trump loves to talk about how U.S. allies need to do more. Well, in the South Korean case, right, if we don't let you guys do more, then the argument doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, we should get rid of all these things and then come back and talk to South Korea about its own defense. And so the idea that you guys can build your own nuclear-powered submarines is great, right? That allows you to build quieter submarines, and you can deploy them against the Chinese and the North Koreans if the North Koreans ever build a sub. And that's all really good, right? It sort of increases the defense burden sharing in the region, which is something that the Americans want. So it strikes me as a win-win all around.
But many had been, actually concerned about how China would feel about this. So let's turn to the summit with President Xi. So despite closer coordination with Washington, President Lee actually pushed for economic and cultural cooperation with China as well, including movement on lifting informal sanctions like the Korean wave ban. How would you evaluate the balance that Seoul is trying to strike over here? Do you see some concrete room for progress?
Speaking to me?
Professor Kelly.
Yeah. And I think this is good, right? I mean, South Korea's progressives, the Minjutan, right? South Korean progressives have long sort of argued for détente with North Korea and China, right? That South Korea is sort of in this middle position between the U.S. and China, and even though it's a U.S. ally, it's trying to sort of avoid openly lining up against China and sort of provoking a kind of Cold War standoff in the region. That strikes me as smart diplomacy for a smallish state like South Korea, which is kind of trapped in the middle of these much larger states. It's a tough neighborhood. It's not easy. And so trying to sort of build these kinds of informal diplomatic bridges and sort of pull down some of these barriers we were talking about, all of that makes sense. It's low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, the K-ban, isn't that big a deal. I mean, I guess it is for that particular industry, but it's not sort of a strategic issue. But to the extent that it builds up towards the larger strategic issues, for example, like what these Chinese emplacements are in the West Sea, which nobody really quite knows what's going on there, to the extent that the South Koreans and the Chinese laying the groundwork for improved discussion on the really significant geopolitical issues like North Korea's missiles and the West Sea and stuff like that, this is good stuff. But I mean, at some point, Lee and Xi are going to actually have to get to the strategic issues that are pushing South Korea and China apart. And I didn't really see too much movement on that this week.
But as for South Korea, balancing ties with Washington and with Beijing are always tricky. So, Professor Lim, do you think Seoul's dual-track approach to diplomacy is still viable, especially in the climate of intensifying U.S.-China rivalry?
Well, we have been struggling with how to position ourselves. I mean, because of our geopolitical situations, again, the Korean Peninsula is literally the peninsula between the Eurasian continent and then Pacific Ocean. So peninsula faces always, this powers from the both sides. So there's two sides when the two powers are conflicting. When those two powers conflict, definitely the peninsula can face further bigger challenges, which is not only probably for the Korean case. Some other peninsula countries might have a similar situation, but especially the Korean peninsula situation is more serious because, again, we have two gigantic size countries, continental power, again, the Russia and the China, and at the same time, we, of course, have our ally, the United States. So, even though a so-called equidistance diplomacy or like a kind of balancing, or whenever we are trying to have literally a balance between the continental power and Pacific power, we have been in trouble. So I don't think, even though our government is trying to have a good relationship with everybody, which is of course a desirable approach, but I don't think everybody's relationship can be at the same level. Of course, we do have a priority. So in that sense, I don't think 50% on China versus like a 50% on the United States. I don't think like that way, because of course, this is not a zero-sum game. And of course, we have the priority. And another thing I need to highlight is today's U.S.-China strategic rivalry is qualitatively different from the competition between the U.S. and the Soviet during the era of Cold War. Back then, it was literally more like a zero sum. But these days, again, the U.S., China, mutually, they are also interdependent. I think of, negotiations or dialogues between the Washington and Beijing recently, it has proved how interdependent the two economies are. So what I'm trying to say is, again, this is not a zero-sum game, so we don't need to see the game with that kind of framework. And at the same time, I would say, again, even though we want every positive relations, but still we have priority.
Right. Prioritizing on your own interests would seem like the key of the Lee administration now. Now, let's also touch upon the Japan front. So President Lee's summit with Prime Minister Sanai Takaishi emphasized reviving shuttle diplomacy as well. So Professor Kelly, what kind of long-term impact could this approach have on the future of bilateral relations between the two?
Between Korea and Japan, I think it's a good thing, actually, thank you. I think it's a good thing, actually, that you had a South Korean progressive president who was actually sort of willing to sit down and sort of at least go through the motions with the Japanese, right? Your viewers may recall that when Moon Jae-in was president, the last progressive South Korean president, relations with Japan really bottomed out. Traditionally, it's been a greater challenge to deal with Japan for the South Korean left than for the South Korean right, which is more willing to sort of deal with Japan and sort of line up with the Americans against China and North Korea. South Korean progressives, of course, are much more mixed on this. There's a more sort of hostility out there on the South Korean left towards Japan. And I think Lee Jae-myung is maneuvering all of those shoals much better than his predecessor, his liberal predecessor, Moon Jae-in did, right? I think it's really good that you had this meeting and it came off cordially. You're seeing the photographs right now. It came off really well, and it looked like the two got along pretty well. There they are, smiling and shaking hands. I mean, that's something that I'm not sure Moon Jae-in was ever able to do. And so to that extent, if you look at sort of previous South Korean conservative presidents, I think the record here is much, much better. I think the Lee administration deserves credit for how well they pulled this off.
Right. So it's, excuse me. It's quite impressive, and of course, the bilateral relationship always needs some steady handling, especially given the historical past between the two sides. Now, zooming out a little bit, the fact that both President Trump and President Xi came to South Korea during the APEC season positioned Seoul as something of a diplomatic platform. Professor Lim, do you think this shows potential for Seoul to serve as a wider bridging role in global geopolitics?
As I mentioned earlier, Peninsula by nature, it faces always again the geopolitical challenges more seriously compared to other probably countries. And because of that challenges, South Korean government, any South Korean government has been trying to have a good relationship with both sides. Of course, that has been a difficult task for the government. But again, as I mentioned, we definitely have the priority. ROK-U.S. alliance is the fundamental principle for our foreign and the defense policy. I think not that many, I don't think that many people in this country will disagree with that view. So having said that, again, that does not necessarily mean that we want to see China with a very, negative perspective. Of course, China is the largest trading partner and then closest neighbor from our side. So when the two countries, again, the U.S. and China, when those two important countries can have a better relationship, which is the situation we are looking for. But unfortunately, even though they are mutually interdependent, however, still they are competing, especially about the future technology. So these days, there's competition between the two superpowers is not really Iron Curtain-like situation. is more like a porous. Again, in some area they do compete, but in other area they do cooperate. So we have this mixed situation. So I think it depends on, if I go back to that question, I think it depends on which agenda we are talking about. So I think South Korea can suggest a more common agenda for those countries for more like a constructive relationship. And in that sense, again, South Korea does have, I think, has a potential power and then capability to be a coordinator or like a facilitator or sometimes a mediator to work together with the other bigger superpower.
So it seemed like this diplomatic super week was a good opportunity for Seoul to show its potential. Now, looking ahead, with COP30 and the G20 just around the corner, another busy events lining up, where do you see South Korea's diplomatic agenda heading next? And also tell us what kind of issues or arenas might become more prominent.
Sure. As I mentioned, again, pretty much I think the upcoming events are dependent on the current situations. In some area, probably more cooperative situation we can't probably expect, especially climate change related issue, because we all know Mr. Trump, President Trump's and his administration, their energy policy and then climate policy changed pretty dramatically. So having had this kind of, again, the situation, they do now emphasize more energy security, which is somewhat understandable. And many other countries are now more concerned about the energy security, which is a more like a short-term challenge compared to, even though climate change is going on and as not a future issue, it's already our reality. But still, countries now prioritize more like a short-term energy security, like a stable supply, like challenges compared to the global action to the climate change. So definitely climate is one of the probably most challenging issue to proceed further. However, as we saw from the latest, again, the APEC in Gyeongju, AI or like even cybersecurity as well, all this emerging technology, how to gain the control or how to manage or how to protect the information data of our own people, those kind of things are really emerging challenge and an emerging concern for many different countries in the world. So for that, I think South Korea-like country, which has technology and which has, of course, its own ideas and norms and value, I think this kind of country, South Korea-like country, can contribute more to help the countries gather together to discuss about the future of AI and cybersecurity too.
Definitely. So with many multilateral summits ahead, we'll have to see if South Korea could keep the momentum going moving forward. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Lim.
Thank you.
And of course, Professor Kelly, we really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.